Hello, everyone. My name is Aerin. My proper pronouns are they, them, their. You'll see me look off to the side of the screen a lot because I'm reading off of my notes, but I like to have my hands free just in case. Just a quick bit of background about who I am and for the last handful of years, I have been a outdoor instructor in some capacity. For the last 4 years, I've worked with MESD Outdoor School as a program leader and as a plants field instructor. And then over the summers and occasionally during the winters, I've also worked as a lead instructor with Trackers Earth here in Portland. Now, despite a lot of the skills I'm going to show you and perhaps some of the depth we might get into today, I did not really grow up super outdoorsy. Camping was not a thing my family did growing up. I remember going camping maybe a handful of times. It was very much glamping. There were power outlets involved, and I think someone brought a TV once. So being outdoorsy was not something that I grew up with, nor came second nature to me growing up. It wasn't until I graduated high school that I and a couple of my friends decided to go camping out by ourselves. And that's when I started to teach myself how to camp and what does it mean to exist outdoors. And so, that's when I decided to learn and be okay with making mistakes and teaching myself. And finding a community of people that would be willing to share some of the knowledge that they had learned. And my biggest philosophy throughout the years has been trying to take less gear with me and and more knowledge whenever I go out into the forest. So today, we're going to be talking about learning how to start a fire using a ferrocerium rod. And then we're going to go way back in time and technology and talk about some traditional friction fire methods. We're going to talk today. Today we're going to talk about using a hand drill. But first, before we do anything, before we talk about any of those bits of technology, why would we bother learning any of those skills or learning any of those tools? Because, like many of you, fire comes really easy to us. We have lighters, we have matches that give us ready and available flame. So why bother learning anything else if you can just carry those in your pocket? Well, I remember watching a documentary when I was younger of a Samoan woman talking about that people would tend to carry their fire in your pockets, and she talked about matches or lighters. But sometimes these things that you carry in your pockets get wet, and sometimes they don't work out really well when they do get wet. So for example, I have this box of matches, and I've seen a lot of people carry matches out with them, and I have this thing of water. Some matches, you're more than welcome to get them. They don't really work when they get wet, but yeah. And if this is your last match and it gets wet, what do you do? Or sometimes lighters, they also get lost or they get wet. But we're going to talk about a modern tool first when it comes to starting a fire. So before I start showing you skills, I want to be very clear with everyone. I am teaching off of my balcony, and I live in a second-story apartment. So some fire safety things that I currently have with me is, one, I have a lot of water off screen just in case I need to douse something. Two, and I encourage people to do this if they want to practice. If you do want to practice fire starting and fire, even like miniature fire making, you want to have a base that's not going to burn. And I recommend, I just went into my kitchen and grabbed the crappiest or the saddest, most beat up looking baking sheet that I have. And it's gonna be my base for when I start a fire today. So that's gonna be my that's gonna be like sort of a safety net for me. And you can also do this when you go out, if you ever are in the woods and you wanna practice. Make sure that if you are going to be practicing throwing sparks, starting small fires, that we're not damaging the environment around us by leaving burn marks everywhere. So having a small platform in which to practice is something I always recommend. So, like I said, a lot of people carry their fire when they go into the woods in their pocket or in their bags. And sometimes, though, I tend to just carry my fire in my mind and in my muscles. But we're going to talk about pockets first, things that you can shove in your pockets. So matches, they can get wet. And I'm actually going to lower the camera down so you can actually see better right now. So, matches, they can get wet. And when they get wet, they tend not to work really well. Lighters, also the same thing. And they also run out of fuel. If you run out of, it's really hard to tell sometimes to whether or not your lighter is going to run out of fuel. So we're going to talk about something else that you can find. And this is known as a ferro rod or a ferrocerium rod. It also has a couple different names and it looks like a couple of different things, but this is the one that I have. I have another one here as well that's been much more heavily used, but you might hear this be referred to as a ferrocerium rod, a ferro rod. Some people refer to it as a metal match, and I'll show you why. And some people also like to call this a flint and steel. Calling this a flint and steel is a bit of a misnomer because this, and this little tin that I have, this is what we call a flint and steel. It's a piece of high carbon steel and a harder rock. And the reason why people mix these two things up is because they work off of the same idea, that you want to find something that is harder than either your ferro rod or your steel to scrape off a tiny bit of it. And in that action, the metal contacts with the air and causes a huge spark. Now, with steel, you will probably not see this, but if I hit it against my rock, the rock is harder, it scratches and scrapes the metal surface and shoots very small sparks. However, I'm gonna a little bit closer. There we go. However, with a ferro rod, this has the ability to shoot very bright and hot sparks. Now, these are very popular tools that people will bring out with them, and there's many different ways that you can throw sparks. And in fact, when I first got mine, I spent an entire afternoon practicing how to use it over a baking sheet or a stone floor. But in order for you to use a ferro rod, metal match, whatever you call it, a lot of them come with a striker, something that is a sharpened piece of metal that has sharp edges. And I can tell that this is sharp just because it kind of scratches me whenever I am, whenever I rub it against my thumb. And I can also see it scratch. Now, because a ferro rod is not a flint and steel, this metal that this is made out of is much softer than steel. So if I happen to not have a striker for it, I can use a couple of different things. I can use the back of my knife, if my knife back is sharp enough, to throw sparks. If I am in a situation in which the back of my knife isn't sharp, say this one, doesn't really want to throw, I could sacrifice the edge of mine to throw sparks. And, you know, if you need a fire more than you need a knife, that might be a route worth pursuing. But you can also find any rock with a hard edge. Now, if you want to test to see if something is harder than it, all you need to do is just find a rock. I'm going to take the rock from my flint and steel set. And what you can do is just check to see if it scratches it. And all I have to do is just rub it against it. And you can see that where it has been scratched, it has become shiny because I'm scratching away this layer of oxidation on top of it. So you can see that it scratches and it can throw sparks. So that's a spark. A spark is one of the three things that you need to complete your fire triangle. One, so spark represents our heat. Oxygen is another. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is fuel. Now, whenever I go out into the woods, I tend to carry with me a fire kit. And if you go online and you see a lot of, there are many videos that you can see of people carrying around their fire kits. They might come in a bag that they got from a military surplus store. They might have sewn their own leather one. They might carry it in a burnt out tin. And we can talk about why tins at a later time, tins are important. But honestly, when I first started going out into the woods, I carried my fire kit in a plastic bag. And the reason why is because it kept everything inside of it dry. Because this will spark even when it's wet. So, little water, get it all wet. You even can get the pan wet, and it will still throw sparks. It'll still throw sparks. So, even when I go out, even for just a day, what I like to do is I like to make sure that I carry stuff to help me with my first fire. So, this is my fire kit. I have a Ferro Rod, and then I also have some stuff to help me with my first fire, because it can take a lot of work to get a fire going, and so you want to make sure that your first one is a sure one. But we're going to back up for a second, and we're going to just talk about building a fire. So fire needs three things. It needs heat, which we have in the form of our Ferro Rod, oxygen, which is all around us, and then it needs fuel. Now, like a lot of things in life, a lot of the hard work happens before you even see it. So when it comes to starting a fire, a lot of your hard work should be done before you even get ready to start it. And hard work meaning like you should have gathered up all of your materials that you're going to be using to start the fire. You have your fire built before it's even going to start. Because there's nothing worse than when you are cold and it is starting to rain and you're trying to get a fire going and it goes out because you had to run away and grab more fuel. So be smart, be efficient, get all your firewood ready, get it all built before you even decide to start it. But I have this small little pile going for me. I'm not going to start a huge fire on my balcony, but I will show you how this will start. So one of the things that I carry in my fire kit, especially when I'm teaching students, is I carry some form of tinder. This right here is the fibers from jute cord, and you can find jute cord at the hardware store. It looks like this rope that you can see right here, and when you start to unravel it, you can start to see all of the different fibers start to separate and kind of start to look like a hairball. I always tell people that if you want to have good Tinder, it should be light, it should be fluffy, it should look like a hairball. This isn't the only sort of Tinder that you can have. Other fibers work. For example, this one right here, this bundle is made from sisal twine. And you can even be funny and take some green jute cord out there with you as well. But you don't have to use Tinder. If you have good technique, you can have this object right here. This is called a feather stick. This is used when you want to shave very fine little shavings off of this single stick. And because of how hot the sparks thrown from a ferro rod is, it'll catch this on fire by itself. Now, let's say I had a fire belt, and let's say I was about to start it. There are many different ways in which you can use a ferro rod to start a fire. Meaning there are many different techniques, but here's a couple that seem to work well for me. So I have something to scrape it with. I'm going to be using my scraper that I pack with this. And I'm going to just hold it nice and firmly in my hands, like I'm pinching its nose. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be holding at an angle where I can see it and feel it and hear it scratch. Now, a lot of people want to hold it above, or they want to spark the fire and just throw sparks at it. And that's fine, but you run the risk of flicking whatever tinder you have away while you're trying to start a fire. So there are two ways that you can avoid this. You can hold this nice and firm, pressed up against the ferro rod, and instead of moving the scraper towards your tinder bundle, you can actually rip it away. And when you do that, it keeps your hand nice and far away from the impending fire. It makes sure that the tinder bundle stays put. And it can also throw a nice flower of sparks around. So that's one method in which we can use to start a fire. The second one that I tend to favor is I'll take my tinder, and I'm gonna take it and tease it apart just to make sure that there's enough space between everything. There's enough oxygen able to flow through it. And instead of hovering over it, I'm instead going to press it down using my ferro rod. And this is the one that takes a little practice, and I encourage people that if they do get a ferro rod to practice with it, is after pinning it down, I'm going to take my scraper and I am going to scrape it straight down into my tinder, and I'm going to let my hands stop me just before I hit the tinder itself. And then I'll get another fire. Or at the very least, I'll start my tinder, I'll light my tinder. Now, I like that one because if you're in windy conditions, it can help make sure that your fire stays put, as it were. And it is very good at concentrating all of the fire at the one spot that you're pointing at. Because it can sometimes be hard to aim doing it in one direction versus another. Now, if you do that, you run the risk, though, of unevenly wearing out your ferro rod. So you can see it's this ferro rod that it sort of has like a dip down the middle, but the end is like still nice and wide. That's just due to starting it and stopping it at certain spots. Third method that you like, that I tend to also like, is in the event that it does happen to start to unevenly wear at the very tip, you can choke up on the ferro rod itself, holding the scraper with one hand, pressing firmly down, and then you just want to flick with your other hand, and you can throw sparks that way. That one takes a little bit of practice. That one also takes a little bit of hand strength, but it'll make sure that you're able to get as many fires from a single ferro rod that you can before you decide to call it quits. Now, earlier I'd spoken about different things that you can light on fire. I will admit the things that I'm using right now to demonstrate how to use a ferro rod are things that are really easy to catch on fire. You don't even have to use jute twine if you have cotton balls. Those are also things that are work very well. But let's say you didn't bring any tinder. Let's say all you had in your pockets were a knife and your ferro rod. What do you do then? No tinder. And for whatever reason, you can't seem to find any tinder in the forest where you're at currently. Well, what you can do is you can look around and you can try and find some sticks. These sticks, just like straight sticks like this, any kind of sticks on the ground, anything you can manage to find. And even if it's on the ground, oftentimes sticks on the ground are wet. You want to look for sticks that are standing upright because they are going to be dry because they're safe from the moisture from the ground. But even sticks on the ground are able to provide you with fire by carving them into a feather stick. Now, a feather stick is when we take a stick, such as this one or this one, and you, using a knife, carve it down in such a way that it makes these nice little feathers or these curls. And while that's a topic for another day, I want to at least show folks that without any tinder, you are still able to light a fire with this. And this is also a good, it's also a good thing to have when you want to start your fire. So you can see that feather stick wants to light a fire, and you'll notice that it's going to burn all the feathers nice and hot, but the main stick is going to stay put. So you want to make sure that, as I've said, if you have spent the time to start a fire, that you spent all the time beforehand building it, that you have a wide variety of sticks, not just things that are this size, but or the size of your tinder, but make sure you have everything in between, because a fire can only grow gradually when you feed it gradually. So I'm gonna take this off. So yeah, so those are the basics of using a ferro rod. Like I said, a ferro rod can look like many different things. This one is mine that I had just bought. I was able to buy the rod by itself, and then I mounted it to my own handle. This handle is made out of something called fat wood or pitch wood or resin wood, and it is just a kind of wood that has been impregnated with sap from a decaying tree, and it helps me start a fire if I find myself in some sort of adverse condition. I also, as I previously showed, had the other ferro rod, and I had bought this from a vendor from Saturday Market. Sometimes you'll also see ferro rods that are in the shape of a brick, a little square or rectangle, and you'll notice that they don't just give you a ferro rod. So you can see with this one, was bought with a thing of magnesium attached to it. Now, magnesium is awesome. It's helpful if you want to start a fire because you can scrape off pearls from it as well. And they won't light on fire. They don't react nearly as fast. But if you want to make sure that your fire stays nice and hot, you can gather these bits of magnesium together and it'll start the fire. While this comes in handy, I will admit that for my experience, the amount of magnesium that they give you is so much in comparison to the Ferro Rod. The Ferro Rod that was given, that I gotten from this one was maybe the size of like the end of a pencil, whereas this one is the size of the pencil itself. And the advantage to me between a Ferro Rod versus a lighter is that I know exactly how many fires I can get off of a Ferro Rod because I can see it wear down. With a lighter, it's hard to tell when it wants to work. Maybe it got wet. Maybe it ran out of fuel. But they have their place, and it helps to know many different ways of starting a fire. So yeah, I'm going to set these off to the side, and then we're going to talk about a more primitive way of starting a fire. So there have been many different references that I've seen in cartoons over the years. I'm a very strong avid cartoon watcher where people try to start a fire by taking two sticks and rubbing them together, and somehow that's supposed to make fire. I actually want to show you how to do that. Because let's say you went into the woods and all you brought was a cutting tool. Let's say you just brought a small knife, and you are tasked with now to make a fire. What could you do? Well, this method that I'm about to teach is something called a hand drill, and it's one of the oldest friction fire methods that exists in our world. It's a skill that I consider to be an ancestral skill. It's one that you have seen, or that we have seen from all over the world. It existed here in the Americas, it existed in Europe, and you can even find this skill being demonstrated over in Australia. So why teach you this one? Well, I personally say that this skill is the simplest to learn because you only need two things. You need a stick that is straight. And I would say if you're going to start practicing with this, you find something that is about the size of your pinky, the diameter of your pinky, or something about the size of a pencil, depending on how big your hands are. So over here, I have a couple different examples of different things that I've used as spindles, or that could be used as spindles. And you want to make sure that it's relatively straight. The straighter it is, the easier it is on your hands. Because it's really easy to give yourself blisters practicing this. Then, second thing that you'll need is what we call a baseboard. Now, a baseboard is, well, it's a piece of wood that can come from, say, a vine or a tree that you are able to use and spin place a spindle onto and spin. Now, if you ask 7 different people, I found in my experience that if you ask 7 different people how to start a hand drill fire, what materials you need, what technique that you should employ, how you should sit and how you should position your posture and whatnot. If you ask 7 different people, you'll get 8 different answers, because there's no wrong way, because you need to find a technique that works well for your body. Now, before I started practicing putting a spindle to board, I recommend practicing with your hands empty first, just so your hands get the motion. Because whenever I've just given people the simple instruction of take the spindle, put it into the socket that I'll show you how to make in a second, and just go ahead and spin it down. And I'll see people either just, it's actually really hard for me to demonstrate because my muscle memory wants to kick in, but I'll see people start spinning it and they just keep spinning it. They might drop it somehow, or it spins out of their hands, or this seems their hands just go everywhere, or they only just run down the stick itself, spindle itself. What I recommend is that find a stick. Doesn't even have to be a stick that you are going to be starting a fire with. Just find a stick, say like this one. I would never hand drill with this one, it's too thick. It's also wood that's too hard. And just practice with it. Just practice getting comfortable with it in your hands, and you'll see 2 bits of technique used. So you'll see people either float, which is sort of keeping your hands at the top of the stick, or run, which is where you see people push their hands further and further down. Now, floating is the hardest part. And so practicing that, it can look like a couple different things. You take your hands and you can sort of pretend that you're washing it. Or if anyone remembers how to do the itsy bitsy spider, just sit around and just practice getting used to this motion. Because when I learned it, I was taught just do the itsy bitsy spider, but have your palms always touch. That's how you get it to float. You're gonna keep the tip of the stick, your spindle in your hands. You're just gonna do the itsy bitsy spider, run up the wall, just out. Another thing that you can do to practice is, if you take your spindle, put it over your shoulder and hold it in your hands. And what you're gonna do is you're just going to spin it in your hands back and forth without the spindle changing positions. Because it's really easy for the spindle to go up and down because you're just using one hand more than the other. But if you're using both hands equally, the spindle should stay right where it started. Now, we're gonna float. If your hands are dry, if they feel slippery, get them wet. You can see a lot of people lick their hands or spit on them. Up to you. Sometimes they'll rub their forehead sweat onto their hands, get it nice and grippy. But first we're gonna start with floating. And the purpose for floating, so itsy bitsy spider. Sideways a little bit more. Yeah. Itsy bitsy spider. The purpose for floating is that we want to heat up the baseboard. Because when it is warm is when you're going to produce sawdust. And you're just gonna practice. I would recommend people just practicing this for a bit. Just get comfortable with this, get used to this motion. Because if I tell you if I tell people to just start fire drill, everyone already starts doing the run. I don't really feel like I need to teach you that. One thing I do want people to know is that in my experience, my best method or posture of holding my hands is I actually keep my hands nice and relatively flat. You'll see people push their hands together and tighten their hands nice and tight. And you'll see that my fingers are nice and spread out. And I have found, a lot of my friends have found that you're just wasting energy because you're having to turn your hands and your wrists, and you're forcing your muscles in your arms to tire a lot faster because you're making yourself tense in a way that's not giving you power towards your stick. So practice keeping your hands nice and firm, almost like you're doing like cat claws, but just straighten them out a little bit. That way there's always constant contact. And you don't have to flex your wrists to make sure that there's constant contact and you're tiring yourself out. So let's say you found a spindle. Let's say you found a spindle and you found the board. What I'm using right now is this vine right here is a clematis. It's a climbing vine. You can see it's nice and fibrous, and I can indent it with my thumb. I can, the fact that I can indent it with my thumb tells me it's a pretty soft wood. And then right here, what I have as a spindle, this is mullein. Mullein is a very common plant that you see grow alongside the road or in some abandoned like lots. It has nice long fuzzy leaves. It makes tall stalks, and it makes some nice yellow flowers. But you don't have to use mullein. Again, any thin, soft stick will do. So right here I have some sunflower stalk. This one right here is some more mullein. I even have a stick from a cottonwood tree. So as you can see, it doesn't have to just be, you're not limited to just what you can find. Find whatever sticks or stalks that you can find and are able to gather and experiment. One of the things that my friends and I used to do was when we were first learning how to do this is, what is the weirdest combination of woods that we could use to get a coal? So, you know, find yourself an experiment. But I'm going to demonstrate using clematis, which is something that you can find a lot, and mullein, also things that you can find a lot. So, with my baseboard, what I'm going to do, and you can see that I've done a few of these before in one of them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take one, and I'm going to flatten out the top of it, just like that. And then I'm going to start a new notch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure how thick the thick end of my spindle is to the baseboard. The reason why you want to do the thick end down is because the thinnest end will be spinning in your hands, and that'll give you more rotations down here, and more rotations mean more speed, and it'll also mean more sawdust, which we'll talk about here in a second. So I'm going to make, with the point of my knife, I'm going to make a quick indent, or a quick little notch here, around, for my spindle. It doesn't have to be anything pretty. Doesn't have to be anything pretty. I'm just literally gouging out a quick notch for my spindle. Now, the baking pan is a little hard because it has a lip on my legs, and this is the posture that I like to sit. I sit nice and straight up, or here. So I sit nice and straight up, my shoulders are back, I'm able to breathe, nice and relaxed. And then I'm sitting not necessarily cross-legged, I have one leg tucked in, but my other leg is gonna give me a hand. So I'm going to set this on top of leather, just because the leather won't catch on fire. But also a piece of leather is nice because when you do friction fire, as I'll show in a second, you're gonna want to protect whatever you're doing friction fire on away from the moisture and the cold from the ground. So this is gonna be gonna try and do this. And I'm just gonna start here. I'm just going to start by floating. My spindle has already been cut. I just cut it down to size, and a good size rule for me is that you take your hand and place the tip at the tip of your middle finger. It should come right around your elbow. That is the shortest length that you should start with. Can you go shorter? You totally can. It's just a little bit harder to start out with. But right around here is a good sweet spot for you. So with this new notch, I'm just gonna start by floating. And the reason why I'm floating is I'm starting to burn the board in. I'm getting the board hot. I'm not trying to start a fire right now. I'm just gonna start getting it warm. I'm gonna make sure that the notch is burned in so that way my spindle does not fly out of its socket. I might even do a couple of runs just to make sure that it's burnt in. And now notice that my hands are always touching ourselves. I'm not like bowing my hands out a lot, tiring my arms out. Great. So I see that it's burnt in. Now, I'm gonna change the angle a little bit shorter. So with it burnt in, you can see that I have made a new hole. This one's an old one, and you see that has a notch. And I'm gonna carve the notch too. Now, if you were to take a piece of pie, whole circle, if you were to cut that in half once, you have a hemisphere, cut that again, you have quarters. You want to cut a notch into your circle, something about the size of like an eighth of the circle. Doesn't have to be anything super precise. You can see that notch here is just about that size, but it can be bigger, it can be a little bit smaller. Your mileage may vary, but something around that size, because as I was spinning it, I was collecting all of this little sawdust you can see at the edge of my knife. And that's what's going to give me my fire. But if I'm just going to keep spinning it, all that's going to happen is that sawdust is going to just come off the edges. I need a place for it to go. I need a place for it to collect. So carving the notch, I'm just going to take my knife. I'm going to carve a little piece of pie out of this small circle. And when I do, it's going to give me this little channel in which the sawdust is going to come out of. Now, I've heard people make different comments about it, that your notch, and I'll come a little bit closer, your notch should not go to the center of it, it should be right outside the center, or it should stay right outside. But again, your mileage may vary. I have examples of where I've gotten successful fires utilizing both methods, stopping just short of the circle, or the center of the circle, or going where the end of it touches. But again, test it out, see what works best for you. So, let's see if I'm able to get a full body shot of me doing this. Sweet. So, you have your baseboard ready, burnt in, notch cut out, spindle all set. And one last thing that you want to check before you're going to start, because you're going to put a lot of pressure on your hands with the spindle, just make sure that it's nice and smooth. If you feel any high spots on it, you're going to experience that as blisters maybe. So make sure that it's as smooth as you can get it. If you find any hot spot, just take that down a little bit, or even scrape it down with another piece of wood. And then one thing that you'll definitely need is that if you're going to try and get a coal, which we would use to start a fire, you need something to protect it from the ground. I have this piece of leather here, just because it sits nice and flat for me. But you could also, if you're out in the woods, what you could do is you can just take a piece of a stick and split it and have just a small sliver of it cut out so that it catches the sawdust. You can even find a piece of bark, or if you were earlier carving and have some wood shavings. Using shavings is another way that you could use to catch the ash or the sawdust. So if you didn't have a piece of leather. But I have this piece of leather. Again, it's there because I want to protect the coal that I'm about to get from the cold ground and the moisture. If I were doing this in, say, like a forest area. Sitting nice and straight. I have 1 foot here holding the baseboard down. Take deep breaths. And I'll just start by floating. At first, when you start floating, you might hear this squeaking sound. That's okay. Just keep floating. I'm pushing my hands in. I'm also pressing down a little bit. With my hands in between my hands, I'm also pressing and leaning in a little bit. I'm pushing my hands down as I'm floating. And as I keep doing that, I'll start to speed up just a little bit. Again, I'm not running down yet. I'm just hanging out here, just warming up the board. Make sure you spend some time warming up the board. Might even go a little bit faster. Might even just practice doing some runs. But here, as you warm the board, I'm going to keep track. I'm going to be looking down at the board itself. And I can see that I'm starting to get dust, and I'm actually also getting a little bit of smoke. That's great, but keep going. Smoke does not mean you have fire yet. It does not mean you have a coal yet. It just means that you are getting there. And you want to keep looking as to see where your sawdust level is. Because you want to keep going until it reaches all the way to the top of the notch. And as you keep going, you're going to see the sawdust change into a couple different colors. It'll at first be this light brown, and then as you keep going, it'll turn into a dark brown, and then you'll know you're close to stopping when it starts to be charcoal black. So, see that? It's hard to see when it's on my opposite. That's all right. I'm going to keep floating. Take your time here at this point. You've done a lot of hard work. And you're going to do a lot more work here. So pace yourself. Can you take a break from your hands? That's okay. Take a break. Do some wrist exercises. Stretch your hands out a little bit. And then come back to it when you're ready. So I see that I'm starting to get smoke. I have enough sawdust in my little notch. Hopefully you're able to see that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start doing a couple of runs. Nothing super high powered, but just to keep the board nice and warm. Pressing my hands nice and firm together, keeping my fingers able to touch. Pressing my hands together, pressing down at the same time as I do my run. And I want to get as close to the board as I can when I do this. Because when I do, I'm spending all that time and energy. And just like that, I can see, I'm going to stop because I saw some smoke coming from the dust pile. I'm going to stop because you did a lot of hard work already. I can see that smoking by its own. Hopefully you're able to see that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hand and hold the board down as I lift my foot away. And I'm keeping the spindle in the socket because there's a lot of heat happening here. If I take it away too fast, the heat might escape too fast and I might lose my fire. So now I'm going to gently just take the board out of its socket. I'm going to give it a couple of taps to make sure that the dust pile is loosened away. And right here, what I have, as you can see, is a coal. This is what starts a primitive fire. This coal is able to, hopefully, if you were paying attention, had your tinder ready. And what you can do is you can take this coal and put it into your tinder. And once you bring it into your tinder, hopefully, blow it into a fire. And if it doesn't, that's okay, because you still have your spindle, you still have your baseboard, and you still have most of your tinder left over. You can take a break for a second and try it again. Sometimes your tinder is very uncooperative, and that's okay. But that is essentially the basics of starting a hand drill fire. It's one of my favorite primitive methods. Well, I like to say traditional. Oftentimes people refer to this as primitive, but I don't think there's anything primitive about this. This was very clever, and this was a skill that helped make sure that we were protected, and also helped us cook our food, helped us boil our water. But these are traditional. These are old skills, but these are skills that everybody's ancestor once held. And again, all you need is a straight stick and you need a baseboard. Feel free to experiment. You can, I find my greatest success when starting out is to find two things that are pretty soft. If they're soft, they'll give you nice sawdust. If you want to challenge yourself, you can use something a little bit harder, like say this spindle that I have of big leaf maple. It'll spin and it'll get warm, but it might be hard to get a coal from it. But go out into the woods, see what you're able to find, and see if you can't try and get a coal yourself. But remember, this skill takes a while to learn. It's super simple because it only needs really two things. It needs a stick, it needs another stick. But it's a very hard skill because it's hard to get the technique down. So remember, practice. When I first started learning, I remember sitting in front of my computer, holding a spindle in my hand, just practicing going back and forth, or holding it over my shoulder, practicing back and forth. And it wasn't until maybe my 5th time really sitting down with it before I even got a coal, let alone blowing it into a flame. Blowing it into a flame is its own task, but it's a lot easier than getting a coal in the first place. And it is a super fulfilling skill to learn. Now, even with traditional fire, you want to make sure that you are able to get your first fire ready or carry your first fire with you. Because a lot of people, if you look back, will carry the materials they need to do this. Whether there are tribes in Africa or in Australia or historical evidence that we've seen in both Europe and the Americas, you'll notice that people carried their fire kits with them. Because if you got a good stick and a good board that was able to give you a coal that you could turn into fire, you want to keep that safe, keep it dry, and keep it with you. Sure, you could go out into the woods and make one yourself, but it's in the same way that we carry a ferro rod or a lighter or boxes of matches. Don't think that people didn't carry their hand drill sets either. But this is a lot easier to come across in the woods than this is. So, if you have any questions, feel free to post a comment and let me know, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Yeah, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, we'll see you all very soon.